Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Scheinberg, inventor of the SAM splint. Actually, I just arrived here. I was at a nearby hospital splinting a collie's fracture. The concept of splinting is very old indeed. Ancient tribes used sticks and tree limbs. These primitive splints relied on the natural rigidity of the material, or in this case wood, for support. For nearly 3,000 years, mankind continued to depend on the intrinsic strength of splinting material to support injured extremities. In 1985, the SAM splint was introduced to the emergency medical market. This splint gains its sturdiness almost entirely from unique structural bends. Because in the SAM splint, shape or form creates strength, we were able to construct this splint of ultra-lightweight, flexible components. The splint is 36 inches by 4 1/4 inches. It's a rectangle of thin, soft aluminum alloy surrounded on all surfaces by closed-pore foam. It weighs 4 ounces. It's radiolucent or barely visible on X-ray and is little affected by extremes of temperature, hot or cold. It's completely washable and reusable. Because of its lightweight and flexibility, it's easily stored and carried, which is important for outdoor or field use. The purpose of this video is to teach you how to use this splint. I'm certain you'll think of more uses than I describe here. Step 1 is to learn the basic bends. Following this, I'll demonstrate the use of the splint on the arm, leg, neck, back, and pelvis. Before demonstrating the basic bends and other uses of the SAM splint, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the origin of the splint. In 1968, I served as a partially trained orthopedic surgeon in Vietnam, and at that time I noticed the need for a universal splint. Later on in my orthopedic residency, I was playing with the aluminum foil from a gum wrapper and noticed that that foil splinted my little finger. The next day I simply bought a big gum wrapper and applied some adhesive tape, and that was the beginning of the SAM splint. Everything you're going to see today actually began with that simple little gum wrapper. The most important thing and the very first thing to learn about the SAM splint is how to create the basic bends. When the splint comes out of the roll, it's soft and flexible, just like a noodle. And we have to turn this noodle into a splint of sufficient rigidity to support an injured extremity. The way we do that is to create the basic bends. First, we fold the splint edge to edge in this manner. Then, I place my fingers on the very end of the splint and press my thumbs against my fingers and create a gentle trough in the splint. This little curve creates rigidity. I deepen the curve by squeezing the splint in my palm. The deeper the curve, the more rigid the splint. This limb of the splint is now very rigid, whereas this limb is still soft and flexible. Now, I start on the end of the splint again with my thumbs against my fingers, and I create a gentle, small trough. I deepen the trough by squeezing with my fingers, and now I have two limbs that are quite rigid and a structure that looks like a sugar tong. This sugar tong is excellent for splinting the forearm and the wrist, and shortly I'll demonstrate how this splint is applied to an injured forearm or injured wrist. Now that we've learned the basic bends, I'm going to show the splint applied to a forearm, and then I'll go ahead and demonstrate all the other applications for splinting the upper extremity. Patty, could you come in? This is the sugar tong splint. We simply take the splint and place it over the forearm in this manner. Now, as you can see, the splint is a little bit long for Patty, so I remove the little curve. As soon as I remove the curve on the end of the splint becomes soft, so I can fold it back and create a situation where Patty's fingers are free. The nice thing about the splint is that you can X-ray through it. And if you want to check the pulse or start an IV, you can simply fold the splint back. Perhaps you would want to inject a fracture or inspect a wound. The extremity is still splinted, but you can see whatever you need to see. You can squeeze the splint, if you wish, to contour it more accurately to the extremity. To create a Colles fracture splint, you want to double the SAM splint. You fold it with one limb slightly shorter than the opposite limb, and then fold the end of the splint over to secure them together. This creates a double layer SAM splint. Once again, you want to create a trough in the splint to contour the splint to the body. Now, if someone has a Colles fracture, you don't want to take the splint and start bending it on the extremity. What you do is you look at the person's extremity and then shape it to your own. If they had an injured right wrist, I would shape the splint in this manner to my right wrist, and then I would place it on the patient's right wrist. Likewise, I would shape it to the left wrist if they had an injured left wrist. If their wrist was in a flexed position or had a reverse Colles fracture, I would shape it in whatever position the wrist was before I secured it to that extremity with gauze or cling or some type of wrap. Now, as you can probably tell, this splint could also be used very successfully for an IV board. We use these splints in this manner in our hospital, and it works very well. It also is excellent for arterial lines because you can flex the splint up and bend the wrist in order to adjust for a proper arterial line. You will notice that I typically use the blue foam against my body, and the reason I do this is because the blue foam is slightly thicker than the orange foam. And though you can use the orange foam, it's a bit more comfortable for the patient to have the blue foam directed against the body. Now we'll demonstrate how to use the SAM splint for a humeral fracture. Humeral fractures have always been difficult for me to handle, and the splint has made it a lot easier. What you do is take the splint, and about 8 to 10 inches from the end, you fold it upon itself in this manner. Then you create a trough for the elbow. The next thing is you do the old basic bend, that is you create a little fold in the splint and contour it in this manner. So now you have a stiff limb and a trough for the elbow. Patty, could you come in here for just a moment? So what we do if there's an injured humerus is I slip the trough around the elbow and I place the splint against the extremity in this manner. I then obtain some gauze and I wrap this around the arm. I bend this over if I want to. And then once the humerus is splinted, I secure the arm against the body in a sling or a sling and swath. The nice thing about this splint is that it compensates for the huge amount of swelling. Sometimes you're dealing with large arms and the swelling is tremendous. So this will allow the swelling to spread in this direction, and yet we have this splint above and below the fracture site. So I found this is the very best way to splint a fractured humerus. Typically, in a dislocated elbow, the arm is held in full extension, and oftentimes it's difficult to find a splint sufficiently long to handle that situation. If Patty's elbow is dislocated, her arm would be more or less in extension, and so what I would do is measure the length of the arm and then fold the splint so that we have the proper length. Once again, I would create the basic bends. That is, I would create a bend or trough the full length of the splint. And I can deepen that trough again by squeezing in my palm. I can lay Patty's entire arm in the splint, wrap it with gauze, and we would have a nice splint for a dislocated elbow.